Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is Rousseau on democracy. The main objectives of this lecture are to understand Rousseau's perspective of direct democracy, to understand Rousseau's views on general will and how that relates to democracy in modern times, to explore and understand Rousseau's ambiguous attitude towards the notion of democracy. If there were a nation of gods, it would govern itself democratically, writes Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau holds a prominent place in political philosophy as a profound thinker. In French history, he is known for his critique of the Enlightenment ideals. He was deeply influenced by inequalities of the 18th century French society, and his legacy is marked by contradictions, sparking ongoing debates about his place within the Enlightenment tradition. While some see him as an advocate of individual freedom, others view him as a proponent of collectivism, particularly due to his emphasis on the general will. This dual interpretation has led to conflicting labels, with some categorizing him as a modern totalitarian and others as a romantic collectivist. Hence, Rousseau's ideas directly or indirectly invoke democracy and democratic ideals. The complexity surrounding Rousseau's intellectual stance makes it challenging to firmly place him within specific philosophical paradigms. In contrast to Locke, who is often seen as a hesitant proponent of democracy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau appears as a potentially more radical advocate of democratic principles. However, a closer examination of his writings reveals a nuanced perspective, with Rousseau's conception of democracy showing certain limitations when compared to Locke's ideas. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, as well as his other writings, scholars, philosophers, and political activists have engaged in debates on the extent to which Rousseau considered democracy as either unequivocally the best or perhaps the worst political model for a well-functioning society. Rousseau's attitude is elusive and does not prescribe a rigidly perfect political model. Instead, he lays out some fundamental principles that a society should adhere to. This ambiguity inevitably leads to differing interpretations of his work, influenced by subjective and contextual readings. Rousseau identifies a dichotomy between an ideal theoretical model of democracy and the practical application of democracy in the real world. His hometown, Geneva, serves as a prime example of the democratic ideal he believed could not be easily scaled up to apply to larger societies. Geneva serves as a tangible representation of the gap between his envisioned ideal and the often contradictory reality of democratic systems in practice. Let's talk about Rousseau's view on democracy. Rousseau did not endorse the concept of representative democracy. In his view, democracy was either direct or it did not qualify as such. He firmly believed that a true democracy could only exist when the sovereign authority entrusted the administration of affairs to the entire citizenry, allowing them to govern themselves directly. However, he also acknowledged that any state ruled by law, regardless of its constitutional form, could be termed a republic because it would be guided by the public interest. Rousseau rejected the notion of representative democracy, famously stating that once people allowed themselves to be represented, they forfeited their freedom and ceased to exist as a free entity. His aversion to representative form of democracy was clear when he argued that sovereignty couldn't be effectively represented. Therefore, he contended that representative democracy was essentially a contradiction in terms. Central to Rousseau's democratic theory was the concept of general will. He posited that a state could only be considered legitimate if it adhered to the general will of its members. Rousseau believed that the general will was the means to rectify the unequal and exploitative social relations sanctioned by law and state authority. According to him, the general will represented the collective will of the citizenry as a whole and served as the source of legislation. By obeying the law, each citizen was in fact subjecting themselves to their own will and thereby maintaining their freedom. Rousseau argued that the elected representatives could not determine the general will of the people. Instead, he maintained that ultimate authority and power rested with the people as a collective entity, exercising their general will through voting and the formulation of laws. His democratic theory did not entail a separation of powers as proposed by Montesquieu. Instead, he envisioned a system where people come together to deliberate individually on laws and through majority voting discerned the general will. Rousseau's vision of democracy was suited for a small-scale city-states like his hometown of Geneva. He firmly believed that all political power originated from and resided with the people when they acted in concert to express their general will. In Rousseau's democratic framework, anyone who disobeyed the general will of the people could be compelled to conform as long as they remained within the boundaries of the state. Rousseau's influential work in political philosophy, The Social Contract, notably asserts that democracy and representative institutions are fundamentally incompatible. He argues that sovereignty of the people cannot be transferred or represented, and any attempt to do so compromises freedom and existence. His social contract introduces essential concepts that lie at the core of Rousseau's political philosophy. The opening sentence of Chapter 1, "Man is born free," underscores one of his central themes, freedom. This emphasis on freedom pervades the entire work and is a fundamental aspect of his democratic theory. Rousseau firmly believed in the principle of people's sovereignty and their inherent freedom, making him a strong advocate for democracy as one of the best political models. His view on whether democracy is suitable for a society is significantly influenced by the country's size. He contends that monarchy suits wealthy nations, aristocracy is appropriate for states of moderate size and wealth, and democracy is best suited for small and economically challenged states. One of the key reasons for Rousseau's belief that democracy thrives in small societies is the concept of direct governance by the people. In a small state, it is feasible to convene legitimate assemblies where all citizens can participate, voice their opinions, and have a say in decision making. Rousseau found echoes of his perspective in his hometown of Geneva. However, as a state grows in size, the practicality of direct democracy diminishes, necessitating the use of elected representatives to speak on behalf of others. As the state enlarges, the democratic rights of its citizens become increasingly limited. Therefore, larger states tend to curtail the freedoms that democracy aims to uphold beyond a certain point. Rousseau's view implies that democracy is the most suitable political model for society only in specific circumstances, depending on factors like size and affluence. Nevertheless, many of the democratic ideals championed during the French Revolution, a pivotal era in the advancement of democracy, were rooted in Rousseau's ideas as articulated in the social contract. Rousseau's concept of general will is crucial in understanding his stance on democracy as a political model for society. The general will represents the collective desires and opinions of the sovereign body, a term he uses to refer to all the people, which is a departure from its usage by Hobbes, who primarily associated it with a king. In Social Contract, Rousseau asserts that the general will is always right and tends towards the public advantage. With this statement, Rousseau suggests that just as an individual would avoid making decisions that harm themselves, the sovereign body, through the general will, would not make decisions detrimental to itself. Thus, according to Rousseau, the general will is consistently correct. This perspective contrasts with Aristotelian thought, which posits the inherent presence of evil in every individual. Rousseau's view implies that the general will decides on matters that benefit the collective rather than just the individual. Rousseau also implies that by choosing to live within such a society, individuals willingly submit to the general will. Therefore, even if the general will opposes individuals' personal preferences, they are still obligated to accept it. This idea aligns well with the democratic model, where decisions are often made through collective processes, such as voting. In a democracy, if an issue is decided upon democratically, those who did not vote with the majority are still expected to acknowledge the legitimacy of the outcome. Failing to do so would undermine the democratic system. True democracy inherently provides mechanisms for contesting decisions through assemblies or voting, forming a strong foundation for the acceptance of collective choices. Popular sovereignty in Rousseau's democratic theory. Rousseau's interpretation of sovereign is pivotal in understanding his stance on democracy. The sovereign represents the collective body of people within a state who actively participate in making decisions that impact society, essentially embodying the exercise of the general will. One crucial idea stemming from this concept is that in a truly free community, the sovereign is always considered right. This conclusion aligns with democratic theory, where decisions made by the entire populace are seen as inherently right for the community. However, Rousseau identifies a problem with the sovereign. While the intention of the sovereign are consistently oriented towards the benefit of society, they can be influenced by external factors. This influence necessitates the presence of a legislator, typically an individual or a small group of people, who operate outside the sovereign to enact the laws. This need for a legislator is not inherently democratic, as it implies a degree of authority that exists apart from the collective will of the people. In essence, Rousseau acknowledges the discrepancy between democratic theory and its real-world application. On one hand, Rousseau introduces a concept that aligns well with democratic ideology, emphasizing that anything less than a democratic sovereignty lacks a proper foundation for a society. However, he also highlights the belief that within a democracy, the sovereign can be vulnerable to exploitation by individuals or small groups, which could ultimately lead to the breakdown of the democratic system. This reveals a tension between the idealized principles of democracy and political challenges it may face in practice. Rousseau's democratic theory is fundamentally built upon the concept of popular sovereignty, where the collective entity of the people as a whole creates rules for themselves. This establishes a reciprocal commitment between individuals and society, governed by the general will, which is defined as the common good that unites all citizens within the social sphere. The notion of a common good is achieved through the creation of a covenant or pact willingly entered into by individuals. This covenant serves the purpose of helping people to overcome the two vices that emerge in changing societies: amor dicui, self-preservation, and amor propria, a sense of self-worth derived from comparisons with others. Rousseau places great emphasis on the doctrine of popular sovereignty, making it a central component of his political philosophy. In this context, Rousseau's sovereign is as absolute as Hobbes' Leviathan, with the key distinction being that while Hobbes concentrates all powers in a single person, Rousseau vests sovereign power in the community or the general will. Nevertheless, in both cases, the sovereigns possess absolute authority and their power cannot be circumscribed under any circumstances. It has been aptly observed that Rousseau's sovereign is Hobbes' Leviathan with its head chopped off, highlighting that shared notion of an all-encompassing sovereign authority. Let's discuss the consent of man and the republican ideals in Rousseau's writings. A fundamental component of Rousseau's political philosophy is the concept of the consent of man, which is integral to his doctrine of democracy. Rooted in his republican ideals, Rousseau advocated for a society that is governed by the genuine consent of its members, rather than being imposed by a majority upon a minority. He held a deep admiration for a virtuous way of life in the ancient cities of Greece and Rome. According to Rousseau, these ancient cities were built upon the foundation of virtues, prioritizing qualities such as good citizenship over comfort, luxury, or the oppression of the individuals. Virtues in this context denote the qualities that make for good citizens, where individuals work efficiently and fulfill their civic duties. Rousseau believed that a just state should be established on the basis of these virtues. And in a civil society, individuals must be willing to set aside their private interests for the collective benefits of all. In the context of these ancient cities, the size of the population was small enough that anyone knew each other, erasing the distinctions between the rulers and the ruled. Rousseau's vision idealizes a society where governance is grounded in the consent of its members and where virtues and common good take precedence over personal interests and luxuries. Rousseau's ambiguous attitude towards democracy. Rousseau's attitude towards democracy appears to have a certain degree of ambivalence. At times, it seems that democracy aligns well with his ideals, while at other times he appears to criticize it as impractical and unworkable. Rather than strictly adhering to one political model over the other, Rousseau played a significant role in shaping the underlying ideals of democracy, transforming it from an antiquated and often dismissed system into something more tangible and relevant. Rousseau's work, particularly The Social Contract, sought to engage readers and encourage them to use their imagination, feelings, and intuitive understanding to exercise their freedom in evaluating his ideas. The goal was to empower readers to become judges themselves, determining whether democracy was the best practical model. This shift in perspective places the responsibility on the reader to form their own conclusions about democracy, reflecting what Rousseau truly aimed to achieve ideologically. A key ideological principle encapsulated in Rousseau's statement, "No one under any pretext whatsoever can make any man subject without his consent." It underscores attitude toward democratic theory. He firmly believed in the importance of consent. However, Rousseau also held that achieving true democracy as a form of governance was nearly impossible, stating that there never has been a real democracy and there will never be one. This perspective suggests that while Rousseau was an advocate of the principles and ideals of democracy, he was also cognizant of the practical challenges and limitations in realizing it as a functioning political model. Let's conclude the lecture. Rousseau's staunch opposition to representation and his insistence on direct democracy as the sole legitimate form of governance led him to argue that no nation state, whether contemporary to his era or otherwise, can genuinely claim to possess a legitimate government. Moreover, he expresses doubts about the sustainability of small political entities like city-states practicing direct democracy as he anticipates their inevitable subjugation by larger nation states, resulting in the erosion of democratic principles. Rousseau's skepticism regarding the feasibility of democracy is evident in his assertion that it contradicts the natural order for the majority to govern while the minority is governed. He deems it implausible for people to consistently convene and devote their time to political affairs, reflecting the prevailing sentiment among critics of democracy during his era. Additionally, Rousseau warns of the susceptibility of democratic or popular governments to internal conflicts and civil wars, even going so far as to suggest that even a society of gods would resort to a democratic system, emphasizing its incompatibility with human governance. Despite these overarching negative assessments, Rousseau tentatively proposes, albeit in a brief footnote in the Social Contract, the potential viability of democratic governments within confederations. Subsequently, in a discussion on the governance of the people of Poland, he concedes to the necessity of the government by representation. However, Rousseau leaves unresolved the issue of determining the appropriate size or scale for democratic political associations, underscoring the complexities and challenges he saw in implementing his ideals of governance. With this, we conclude today's lecture. I hope you benefited from listening to it. Thank you.